Hello, good afternoon from New York. My name is Bart van Ark and I'm Chief Economist at the Conference Board, and welcome to our fall program of Window On, our monthly series where we have a panel on hot topics in economy and policy and everything related to this. And this month's focus is going to be on the future of American manufacturing, which is a very exciting topic, a lot debated in the media. But today we have a really very good panel that will help us to really shed some light on where is manufacturing coming from and where it is going, and is this a temporary revival or a permanent better situation in the manufacturing sector. So it's going to be a great panel, but before I introduce that panel to you, let me as always just give you a few quick guidelines that you can benefit from during this webcast. First of all, you can ask questions, and that's very important because this is a conversation between the panelists, but we'd like to hear from you. So if you have questions, there's a chat box at the bottom left of your screen. You put your questions in there. We'll then sort of weave them into the conversation. So anytime put in questions, don't wait until the last minute. We will make sure that we'll pick them up sometime in the webcast. There are a few slides, not many in this presentation, but if you want to download those slides, you can do that. By clicking the file download button, and you can then use them later on or share them in your organization. Sometimes you may prefer to go to full screen and not just look at the slides. In that case, just click the four arrows at the top of your right screen. That will be great. And then finally, at the end of the webcast, there's always a brief evaluation. So please, we benefit from that. Fill it in. It's just going to take you 1 or 2 minutes. And if you want to share this program with colleagues in your organization, then please do so. And then I think there's one more important thing I want to share with you, and that is that you can use CPE credits here in case you are entitled to that. Make sure that you then type in your full name and email address in the space that's provided. Click OK for free pop-ups that occur during the program. Stay online for the entire webcast, and the credit is of course only available for those of you who are attending this webcast live. So let's move on to the next slide. To really sort of talk about what are the topics that we're going to talk about today. There's some good reason to believe that manufacturing has enjoyed a bit of a resurgence, as I mentioned a little earlier, in the United States. We have seen years of falling output, diminishing percentage of the labor force, but the last few years, sort of 2017, particularly 2018, we have been seeing renewed growth. And the reasons for that revival includes many factors that we will discuss in this webcast: a stronger economy, perhaps better workforce qualifications, the corporate tax cut, of course, which has played a role, less regulation, lower transportation and energy cost. But at the same time, it might also be true that this is at best just a temporary revival. Certainly at the moment we see a big decline in industrial production. That could just be a cyclical element. But it might also be that, we're really sort of looking at a new world of manufacturing that may be a smaller manufacturing sector than it was in the past, but a very different one. And a lot of our discussion will focus on what is the nature of that manufacturing sector in going forward. If we believe that there has been a revival, it actually turns out that revival has been concentrated only in a limited number of sectors in the economy. Pharmaceuticals, electronics, aerospace are well-known sectors. But other manufacturing sectors and other companies within the manufacturing sector, depending on size, for example, are still struggling. So we have a lot of questions today. Has the manufacturing sector made a comeback in recent years? How much does it really matter, the manufacturing sector? What does that new manufacturing sector look like? What kind of shape is it taking? Is the needle really changing in that direction? And of course, what should businesses do in order to be part of this resurgence of the manufacturing sector? So we have 4 topics here that we will discuss in quite a bit more detail today. So in this panel, we'll build a little bit also on previous panel discussions. We had in May a panel discussion on American competitiveness. In June, we talked about the American heartland, where a lot of the manufacturing sector is concentrated. So if you want to look back at those webcasts, then please do so, but we'll pick up some of that also today. So let me introduce the panel, and first of all, I'd like to introduce from Washington, where she is today, Katie George. Katie is a senior partner at McKinsey, where she leads the operation practice in North America, but also co-leads the firm's operation practice globally. So she's got a huge portfolio working on programs, everything sort of related to manufacturing. One thing that's very important that Katie has done is that she was one of the lead authors of a McKinsey Global Institute study on revitalizing U.S. manufacturing that was published in 2016. And we hope to hear from you today what your additional insights are from that report, but also what happened after that. It's great to have you on, Katie.
Absolutely. Great to be here.
Thank you. And then from the best place among the four of us today in the Outer Banks is Jim Owens. He's definitely in a good place. Jim, of course, is known for many of you as the emeritus CEO of Caterpillar, where he was the CEO from 2004 to 2010. But since then has remained very engaged in many companies, currently still a director on the board of Alcoa, still on the executive board of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, an expert in the area of manufacturing practice. So it's great to have you on and hear from you today, Jim. Also, I should say you're an economist, and of course I feel particularly pleased also about that. Thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be here and take a little break from
Right, that's good, that's good. And then in the studio, I have my colleague, our CEO, Steve Rutland. Steve is the CEO and president of the conference board, formerly also at the Committee for Economic Development, has led a lot of companies in the US, including AutoZone and Office Depot, which are, of course, retailing firms, but, you know, manufacturers were your clients. So, you know, I think they're important for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you on. Good. So, as always, we'd like to start in the beginning with a poll question and ask you something related to the topic of today. And today, we'd just like to get you sort of take the first temperature, if you like, on the health of the American manufacturing sector. And you have a couple of choices here. Do you think the current health of the American sector, manufacturing sector is very good and likely to get even better? Do you think it has gone through a difficult time, but it will stabilize at current levels? Do you think it's a very mixed bag, but there will be some strong growth sectors, but overall it will still be in decline? Or do you think it's actually pretty bad, and even if the most advanced sectors are not likely to really succeed? So, you know, take your time. There are different ways to look at this, and then I'm going to ask each of our panelists, starting with Katie, to give us a sort of 30-second first impression of what you're reading here, and we're going to close this poll in about 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Yes, good, great, thank you. So there's a very strong majority here, Katie, 78% of respondents saying that it's a mixed bag, some strong growth in sectors, but overall it remains a sector in decline. And then there's a small group of people who say, well, you know, 18% has gone through a difficult time, but it's likely to stabilize. Some people think it's really good and it will grow even further, but it's only 3%. But nobody thinks it's as bad that it will go nowhere. So what's your first response? Do you make this sense? Is that what you're hearing in the industry?
Yes, I would have voted the same way, that I think it's a mixed bag and very dependent on the sector. But I do think that we are at an important crossroads where we have to reinvest in our manufacturing base and our supply chain, particularly with new technologies, with Industry 4.0, in order to continue to sustain strength in the strong sectors and to recover some of the weaker ones. And I think if we don't do that, we could sadly see the numbers going the wrong way and actually lose some of the traction that we've made recently.
So we really need some strategic and policy focus to make sure that the manufacturing sector can develop in those areas where we need to develop it. And that's what we're going to talk about in quite a bit of detail in this webcast. Jim, your first response. You think it's a surprise that people think it's a mixed bag, but do you think there are sectors that really have a strong future?
Well, I probably would have gone with it's gone through a very difficult time, but it may stabilize. I think it's basically we have an economy in transition, and we're moving away from our manufacturing sector, or manufacturing as we traditionally have thought about it, with a very large and very influential blue-collar workforce. The whole mix of labor involved in the manufacturing industry is changing, and is changing for the better in many respects, but it's an economy in transition. But we have a recovery period, I think, was heavily driven by the end of the Great Recession and a recovery in commodity cycles, which have helped American manufacturing firms compete better globally. And certainly the economic bounce in this country coming out of the worst recession since 1938 has been a big factor.
Right.
But I think there's a chance many of our industries can stabilize at this level, but it's not going to be a big growth area, and never a return to the dominance of the blue-collar workforce that people romanticize
Right,
about.
and actually that workforce element is again something that we'll have to discuss in detail, because that is probably one of the key factors that will make a difference what the future of
I think
manufacturing is going to look like.
Hugely important.
Steve, from your point of view, when we look at our members here at the conference board, is that what you hear, that some places are going very well, some others not so good, or do you think there's overall, a more malaise in the manufacturing industry?
No, look, I agree with what Jim said. I think we're an economy in transition. By the way, we've been in transition since our economy was formed back beginning in the 1600s. We were a colony, and I think it was your relatives who settled New Amsterdam here in New York. But
Right.
look, we were a family farm society. We became an agrarian society, and manufacturing was increased. We have been, evolving every decade, and so we're constantly looking backwards as a society rather than saying where are we today and where are we going. So I do think that forever and ever we're going to be seeing manufacturing changing and the definition of manufacturing, and I think that's where we are today.
Right. And to your point of my relatives from the Netherlands, they actually started the services economy here in the United States. They weren't the manufacturers. Right?
Run completely on wind power.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's true also. Yeah, exactly. Good. So let's take a little bit more of a deep dive. Also, for those of you who are not so familiar with the macro numbers on the manufacturing sector, as was already mentioned, the manufacturing sector was much bigger than it was today, but still, U.S. manufacturing is a pretty big deal. Even today, U.S. manufacturing produces more than 18% of global manufacturing output. And that's more than the entire economic output of Canada, Korea, and Mexico together. So it's still a very, very large industry. But it's true that, of course, as a share of GDP, it has declined. It was almost a quarter of GDP in 1970. Today, it's just over 10%, around 11% of GDP. It's gone up a little bit in the recent years, as I mentioned earlier. And still, we're employing about 13 million people in the manufacturing sector. That's about 8.5% of total employment. But we lost 6 million people in the manufacturing sector just over a period of about 40 years. So there's a lot that has changed over time. So Jim, let me start with you, because I think the question then raises, okay, if the manufacturing sector is not that large anymore and not that important for the economy, if it's only 11% of GDP and the rest is largely coming from the services sector, why do we really care? And one of the arguments is that manufacturing is somewhat punching above its own weight in terms of the importance to the economy. Can you clarify that a little bit more from your perspective?
Well, I think I think manufacturing is important. It's important for the health of our economy, for a balanced economy. It's important for, in some respects, our national defense, and strategically we need to be a lot more thoughtful than we've historically been. I'm not very surprised about the big loss of jobs if you go back over a 40-year period from 70 to 2010. Again, the economy in transition, moving really away from a very labor-intensive manufacturing sector to much more services. And in that process, a tremendous amount of automation, which has even been accelerating in recent years. In fact, most of the very sophisticated products that we make today can't even be made with hand-eye coordination and human labor. It requires robotics, sophisticated laser systems, et cetera, to manufacture to the specifications of our modern products. So all of this is a lot more sort of technology and white-collar workforce oriented, which is creating a lot of the value add in the industry, but it goes away from the blue-collar workforce of yesteryear. We've also gone away from very strong labor unions, which I know some people would argue had their virtues, but they also, I think, limited our ability to get the kind of productivity growth that you can get if you have a great teaming environment within a manufacturing environment. So I think there's been a transition to more focus on a process discipline, just-in-time delivery, total supply chain management, operational excellence on the shop floor, a teaming environment where instead of a we-they environment on the shop floor, we've gone more to a structure where people work together regardless of what payroll we're on, and everybody's thinking about how do we improve our cost competitiveness, our global cost competitiveness, and how do we improve our quality because we want to strengthen our company. That's a whole different mindset, but all of those things certainly there's been some labor arbitrage, and trade has been a factor as more countries have gotten more competitive. Bigger transition and the bigger drop in employment certainly is technology related from my perspective.
Right. So, Steve, there's a lot of good things to the manufacturing sector, but somehow it has been in big decline. And the question is, of course, how did this exactly happen? And some of it, as you say, is natural. Any economy transitions and services become more important. But there may also have been some things that we really have done wrong. And as a result, manufacturing perhaps declined more than we would have liked. Is that right?
Well, Jim mentioned labor arbitrage, but look, as long as it's cheaper to use labor halfway around the world, which is about where China is, and ship it across the sea, which means energy prices have dropped, regulation has increased here in the United States, environmental constraints have increased, taxation has changed, union costs have driven labor. So all of these things have conspired, as Jim was saying, in order to create a situation where it's cheaper to manufacture somewhere else in the globe. But I will be a little bit provocative in saying in a knowledge-based economy, in an IP-based economy, what is manufacturing? And Jim's right, there's going to always be a place and a need for manufacture of things, but in an IP-based economy, manufacturing looks like creation of bits and bytes and writing programs and so forth. And I think we're seeing an evolution of the next phase to that kind of manufacturing, more of a knowledge-based and an IP-based manufacturing model. People don't talk about it that way, but that's where we are today.
So economists love to debate with each other all the time whether the decline in manufacturing was really a result of technological advances. It's just more productive and therefore we're just killing more jobs, and that would be bad. It's bad for jobs, but ultimately that's the way it goes. Or whether indeed we have been so exposed to those low-wage economies that basically trade has killed it, and particular concentrations of the manufacturing sector in the heartland, for example, suffered. Where would you put the balance between trade and globalization?
Well, look, if the cost of labor was precisely the same in this country as it was in China, if the regulations around environmental and so forth, the use of water, were exactly the same here as in China, it would be cheaper to manufacture here. Of course, then you run out of labor at some point, and you would take it away from the higher order value. So I think it's an evolution of our economy. We're the most developed nation, and that looks like laddering up on Maslow's hierarchy and therefore becoming more knowledge-based. But there is this situation where with labor arbitrage, it's just cheaper to manufacture things elsewhere.
And it still is, despite rising wages.
It still is, and it's for the foreseeable future.
So, Katie, let me go to you. First of all, how do you respond to what you've heard so far? Does manufacturing punch above its weight, and why? And is this decline something that we could, at least to some degree, have prevented? And then I'll bring up actually a slide for people to take a look at while you were speaking, because you've done some great work, and we reproduced it by looking at some big differences in sort of manufacturing recovery.
Yeah. So first of all, I very much agree with Jim that our manufacturing sector has been in a tremendous transition, and also with Steve that transition in our sector is one where increasingly technological know-how, IP, advanced skills, advanced analytic skills, and data skills, etc., are what are most important in driving the competitiveness of a manufacturing site versus one place over another. And but I do think that manufacturing continues to be absolutely critical to our economy and to economies around the world. What we've seen is that while manufacturing no longer is kind of punching above its weight in terms of driving big blue-collar employment, I very much agree with Jim. Those days are gone, and our workforce is in transition and needs to be in transition. We've made transitions in our workforce before, and we will need to continue. But manufacturing does punch above its weight on a couple of other really important factors. So, for example, manufacturing drives 60% of our exports. It drives almost 70% of R&D. And most importantly, in my mind, it drives 30% of productivity growth in our economy, which is what really drives our standard of living. So it's very important to have a vibrant and modern manufacturing sector. I do agree that the modern manufacturing sector will look very different from what it did in the past. And one of the things that could be good news for the United States is that labor cost arbitrage is increasingly less important in driving decisions about where manufacturing will be done. When we looked at 4 different segments, and you see them on the slide here, you see that those 4 segments are behaving in very different ways in the United States in terms of a couple of different waves of recovery in manufacturing since 2008 recession. You see that some, like vehicles and heavy machinery, are actually driven very much by demand. So automotive demand increases when the economy is healthier in a cyclical fashion, and that drove a very significant recovery in auto production locally when the economy recovered and demand recovered. If you look at locally processed goods, those are things that actually rely very much on proximity to market. And so that also is very much demand driven. Whereas some of the basic consumer goods are still in the sector that's more labor cost driven. And therefore, as Steve said, as long as we have a significant difference in labor costs abroad versus here, you'll see offshoring. But things are changing with new technology. And even what we see in some basic consumer goods industries is that what's driving competitiveness is proximity to market, mass customization kind of business models, all enabled by digital capabilities that make manufacturing far more agile and therefore kind of up the value of being close to market. So there's some good news here that the United States could take advantage of, but I would argue that we're not yet prepared to do so.
So what's interesting about this chart, if you look at it, I mean, the right-hand side, we have this one sector, which is computers and electronics. Actually, I could have added pharmaceuticals and aerospace to it.
Right.
These sectors are going through the roof. And if you would take that out, what is left? You know, even though heavy vehicle and heavy machinery is sort of picking up a little bit, but it's not overly exciting. So it seems an incredibly dual manufacturing sector with only a few highly technological advanced sectors are doing extraordinarily well and driving much of the whole story. Is that overstating it, or would you in large lines agree?
No, it's not overstating it. And what's interesting when you look at the other sectors that are not doing as well, as I said, they are not driven primarily by labor cost arbitrage. And so there really is an opportunity to increase the productivity in those sectors using modern technologies. But I think the alarming facts are that if you look at robotics investment or the investment in other advanced manufacturing technologies, you see much less kind of diffusion of that investment and technology adoption in the United States than you see in some other countries. We've done a report with the World Economic Forum to identify the best, most advanced manufacturing facilities around the world using Industry 4.0 technologies. There are 5 in China. There's only 1 that we identified so far in the United States. Right. And I was just in China, and if you see the kind of aggressive implementation that they have around new technologies and connectivity across their entire value chains and ecosystems, it really is outpacing the modernization of manufacturing base that we see in the United States.
Right. Before we move on to sort of looking at sort of how can we sort of make sure that this comeback gets accelerated somehow, Jim, I want to go back to one point that I already sort of briefly mentioned, and that is the difference not just between industries but also between size of firms. It seems that sort of large manufacturing firms have managed to thrive despite all these headwinds that we're talking about, but it's particularly small and medium that has been hard hit, and that it's perversely very important because, we're talking about supply chains here. You're very, very dependent on upstream smaller firms, and particularly now when we talk about some of reshoring of manufacturing activity, which we'll come back to a little later, this really matters. It looks like we don't have something like we have in Germany, which is called a Mittelstand, which is all these small and medium-sized firms that are really driving a lot of the manufacturing health in Germany. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think if you look at a company like Caterpillar, I mean, we're still a major exporter from the United States, though we manufacture all over the world. We rely on a very strong supplier network, and those are mainly small, middle-sized companies that supply heavy industry. But 50% plus of our value added comes from this supply base, and we've developed suppliers in the U.S. and around the world to support our assembly plants. So I think you have to look at these firms. We need them to be globally competitive. So this focus on digital, on robotics, I think we need a laser focus on global competitiveness in every firm.
Yeah,
And there are ways to get there. And the U.S. is relatively better positioned now because of technology, because there's less advantage in labor arbitrage. The total cost of lasers and robotics and sophisticated manufacturing is kind of a one-time cost, and it's more universal, same worldwide. Whereas labor arbitrage gave them 30 years ago a huge advantage to do weldments in Mexico. But those aren't a big advantage anymore.
Steve.
It's more logistics cost, just-in-time delivery, and sophisticated manufacturing techniques that basically have to be the same the world over. So we need to gear ourselves to focus on global competitiveness from our U.S. base.
Yeah, and just to build on what Jim said, I think this story about Caterpillar having lots and lots of smaller companies. It's the same with every large manufacturing company, whether you're talking about aerospace or auto, where now it's not a vertically integrated system. There's lots and lots of these. So this whole dichotomy between the big business and Main Street cannot be viewed as two independent streams. They're all integrated in their supply chains.
Right. And that's why this sort of big diversity that we're seeing is a bit of a problem, right? Because if you then talk about reshoring large manufacturing activity here to the United States, if the supplier base is basically hollowed out over the years, you have a real competitiveness problem.
Well, that's true, but on the other hand, things can shift, and we're seeing it with the whole Chinese situation with the U.S. and the tariff situation, where people are moving. So, and taxes can do this too, where the assembly of pickups, then the last piece of the assembly has been done here, whereas other pieces have been done elsewhere in Mexico and other countries. You're seeing more of the componentry moved around and last mile assembly done here in the U.S.
Katie, I know you've done a lot of work on this, so I want you to respond to all. Yeah, go ahead.
Sure. I very much agree that things can shift, but we need to be purposeful to make sure that they do. Because what I'm hearing from clients and what we're seeing in the data is just as you said, Bart, that large companies are able to prosper. They are able to make investments in new technologies to stay competitive. And to Jim's point, they are able to source components and capabilities from around the world. If we want to maintain a healthy manufacturing base in the United States, it will be important to invest in our small and medium-sized supply chain partners as well. What we're seeing is that those are the companies that are falling behind in terms of technology adoption and also in terms of workforce preparation. It used to be that large companies provided all of the reskilling, retraining kind of role that then permeated into the SME base as well. And we're not seeing that happen as much now. So those smaller companies are financially unstable and they're getting left behind. And yet, when we look at what will drive competitiveness going forward and whether the United States can take more advantage of proximity to the U.S. market with U.S. local manufacturing, a healthy supply base will be critical.
So, Katie, when you were participating in the 2016 McKinsey Global Institute study on revitalizing manufacturing, you had this very upbeat projection. There are two scenarios here, but the most upbeat scenario would basically add $3 trillion in value added in manufacturing by 2025. It would mean that the share of manufacturing would go up from 11 to 20% of GDP, also adding 2 million additional jobs despite all the productivity growth. How did you get to these numbers? And if you're looking at today compared to 2-3 years ago when you wrote this study, would you still stand by these scenarios or where would you tweak it?
Yeah, as you said, we looked at what would be the upside of really getting serious, and we'll talk later about what that means in terms of public-private partnership, of concerted investment, new capabilities, of workforce preparation and training, et cetera. What would the upside of that be in terms of how healthy could the United States manufacturing sector be given kind of the structural components of our economy versus the way that the globe is moving? And what we see is that as we break down the different types of industries and really look at what drives competitiveness and location decisions in each, you see that in basic consumer goods, there's real opportunity from increases in demand, et cetera, but you don't see a lot of as big in opportunities in the other categories where we believe that the United States can continue to improve its competitiveness through investment in productivity enhancing capabilities. So we see opportunity here. What I would say is we still stand by these numbers in terms of we see the opportunity. In fact, we just published a research piece on how global value chains are evolving. And we believe that we have now seen the peak of global physical goods trade as a percentage of global GDP. And what we see now is that supply chains are becoming more and more regional. Much more of what is made in China is sold in China for Chinese consumer demand. And so this regionalization does create more opportunity for the U.S. and for proximate manufacturing sites, but only if the U.S. is able to keep up in terms of productivity. And as I said, the labor costs are going up in China. We're not seeing that is the crucial decision point in terms of where a global manufacturer would choose to source something. But we are seeing that capabilities in 3D printing, in robotics, in the ability to link information across all parts of their supply chain, the ability to link into in OEMs manufacturing systems, those things do matter. And that's where our concern is that the U.S. is falling behind. But if we were to reverse that, this kind of opportunity that we see on this slide, the 2 million more jobs, is a potential outcome.
So I have a question from the audience here. That's a really nice transition into what you were just talking about. The question here is from somebody in our audience: I don't believe labor costs are that much lower in China anymore, but robotic production seems to be more common in the United States. The change is probably slower in the US for various reasons. So this gets me to the question. I've heard all of you already mention this word, robotics and AI and technology and innovation, everything else. And that's really where the future of manufacturing is. Well, we're not on our own. The rest of the world is doing this too. And China seems to be particularly good at it. So I'd like each of you, and maybe Katie, I can continue with you because you were already on that argument, and then I'll ask Jim and Steve. Of course, it's all about robotics and AI and new technology, but what will we be doing better that will make us competitive relative to the rest of the world, including China? Or what is it that we need to do to make sure that we are better? Katie?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that this is a matter of both investment by individual corporations in these new technologies, but also kind of policy and collaboration opportunities that would really set the stage for the U.S. Being successful in adopting these new technologies.
Right.
What we're seeing is in many, many companies that we work with is something we call pilot purgatory, where companies are trying new technologies, but in kind of individual, isolated use cases in different parts of their supply chain. And they're finding it very difficult to create momentum and a real business case with real return on investment to start scaling these technologies more broadly. And so the work that I referred to before was identifying 26 sites that had scaled these technologies for very substantial performance outcomes on productivity, but even more exciting around agility and flexibility in their manufacturing. And as I said, we see far fewer of these examples in the United States than we found in Germany, in other parts of Europe, and then we found in China and other parts of Asia. And so I do think that there has been a more aggressive kind of embrace of new technology adoption and a much better sense of urgency around driving technology adoption in other places than what we see in the United States.
So Jim, you already mentioned workforce quality before, and of course this has been an issue that's been raised in the US, whether this is not one of our critical problems. Has been our education system be up to speed? Have we been able to really have a good training system, vocational training, internships, apprenticeships, and everything else? So Jim, I will expand a little bit on this topic of what the priorities in terms of workforce quality in manufacturing should be.
Well, I think most of our largest, most sophisticated manufacturers are excited about the opportunity to do training in-house and to work with our suppliers to be sure they come up to speed on the technology curve. It's interesting that for years, I mean, for example, Caterpillar dealers in this country, we've not been able to get the number of service technicians we need, for example, to take care of products in the field, which really, import competition is not a factor there. But they're looking for young people with high school math education, drug-free, who can take the training, and they're prepared to pay for them to get the training. And those jobs pay about double what, say, a teacher pays. And we have been unable to get enough people to fill those jobs for the last 10 years. And, I know, in companies across the country, large, sophisticated manufacturing companies, we need bright young people who are willing to learn, who are willing to work in a teaming environment. And, it's a different kind of workforce than maybe the old 9-to-5 traditional blue-collar workforce, where you did a very tightly defined job and you didn't need to collaborate with your coworkers. In the digital age and with the technologies that we have today, we need people that are going to be on a learning journey for most of their life on the job. And this would be thought of as traditional blue collar. We've got to have that to be successful.
Right.
And, we'll come back to some other factors in sourcing decisions later in this conversation. But I think we do have a challenge in getting a workforce that is, most small, mid-sized employers today are really struggling to attract people in virtually a fully employed economy who are willing to work 40, 50 hours a week and who are willing to learn.
Right.
And who are drug-free. You can't work in many manufacturing environments if you're not drug-free.
Right, exactly, yeah. So Steve, we do a lot of work at the conference board on skills and human capital and all those kind of things. So any response to that specific issue of how we can move manufacturing forward?
Well, no, I think Jim's absolutely right. And if you look at the number of open positions today that employers are seeking to fill, it's millions. It's right around 6 million, I think, was the last situation. But there's about 6 million people looking for jobs, and the difference is a gap in skill sets and/or geography. And so, what we have in the business community need to do with the educational system, whether it's colleges or training programs, is to match skill set development with skill set needs in the geographies where they are needed. And this is just simply an inefficiency in our economy, which is just is ripe for curing. And that's why I think there's so much room in labor productivity, there's so much room in skill set development and all of these things to get this supply chain of human capital right.
So we had this corporate tax cut, about 2 years ago, and that has helped manufacturing, right? We can definitely make a relationship between the uptick in manufacturing output, but it's gone away. The tax cut has been there, and all these effects seem to be temporarily. So the question is, what is it we need to do to make these kind of issues more permanent in order to provide an environment which in manufacturing can grow better?
Well, this is a criticism of stimulative effects like a tax cut, because in a company you're running a business. The tax cut comes in. It's the value of a company is the net present value of future cash flows. To the extent that tax cut drives more cash, you get an increase in the value. But then next year comes along and there's not an incremental tax cut, so therefore, how are you going to get the growth the following year? So it tends to be a very short-term situation, because in cycling it then, you don't have a new tax cut to go. And so that's why people are critical of these kinds of policies. So the kinds of policies that we need deal with the education and the training policies, deal with the regulatory policies that become permanent. The other thing with tax policy, of course, is that politicians love to tamper with them every few years. So as people are capital planning, these are 30-year decisions in a lot of cases, and what are you going to do with a couple of years? You take it and you don't bake it into your long-term decision making.
Look, we have a great conversation. There are many more topics I would like to discuss, but we want to make sure we talk a little bit more about policy because it's important. But before we go there, I want to go back to this topic that was already addressed of reshoring and this idea that, Katie, let me start with you, the shortening of the value chains that we're now beginning to see that, creates a couple of opportunities. I mean, obviously, emerging markets are able, particularly China, able to capture larger parts of the value chains themselves. But with the advance of technology, with the lesser importance of labor cost arbitrage, although to Steve's point, it's still there, but it's becoming less important in many industries, companies now have an opportunity to actually bring technology back here and basically do a lot more integrated manufacturing activity, particularly in the advanced manufacturing sector. So can you tell us a little bit, and here's a little slide from some of the work we did at the conference board, looking at sort of what the business cases are for what we call going local or reshoring or bringing your activity closer to where your customer is. How big is it really? In which sectors and in which industries do you see this happening most in your practice, Katie?
Well, we're going to see, I think, two waves of this. And again, we'll see this if we get the conditions right in terms of having a healthy supply chain, a healthy supply base of our small and medium-sized companies, as well as a really healthy workforce of people who are able and capable and interested in working in manufacturing. And also connecting the dots between where the workforce is and where the manufacturing is going to take place within the country. We have a hugely kind of dispersed and various kinds of local economies in the United States that are all in very different places and have different opportunities and different weaknesses and strengths in terms of the workforce. But in terms of where we're going to see this in industry, we're seeing it certainly in things that are consumer facing, right? So one of the lighthouse factories that I mentioned in the workforce, in the work that we're doing with the World Economic Forum, makes custom lampshades where you can go online and actually use a CAD/CAM program and design your own lampshade and then get it delivered to you in very short notice. So you're going to see that kind of, and you can imagine that kind of manufacturing happening at a Walmart store or happening with, from local distribution centers. The one company we identified that we were excited about in the United States is a 3D printer that's located at UPS hubs and is able to then supply with very fast lead times spare parts and other kind of components for manufacturers. So there's a whole set of capabilities that we're seeing that are really about creating much faster response to market changes and creating much more flexibility from the manufacturing site. And the first place we're going to see that is in consumer-facing products, as well as things like medical products, customized knees and hips, for example, in terms of medical products. But then we're also starting to see that in the industrial internet as well, in terms of in the industrial base, where you're seeing much faster response time to B2B customer requirements as well. So I think there's real opportunity in almost every industry. We'll see the consumer-facing ones go first.
Right, but then I think also sort of in the automotive sector, right, you see a lot of the developments happening, and that's really where, the technology is basically taking over labor, right, and these are highly automated places where, employment growth is relatively limited. But a lot of that employment growth that will come on top of it, indirect, is probably then again in the supplier chain. And the question is, whether it goes back to our earlier discussion on the supplier base. Is the supplier base a bit of a constraint at the moment for reshoring for large businesses?
Yeah, I certainly my clients are saying that the two biggest constraints they face are the supply base issue and the workforce issue. I think on automotive, it's a good example where we're seeing increasingly flexible manufacturing that creates the ability to support what is, an increased demand for customization and greater and greater product complexity, which we see in all industries. The auto industry, of course, is already quite regionalized in terms of manufacturing, so we're not going to see a wholesale change. We already have manufacturing in North America for North America, but we will see strengthening of that sector, but also of other sectors that are more globally sourced right now if we are able to address the issues around the supply base and the workforce.
Jim, are you a believer in reshoring as being a critical driver of U.S. manufacturing growth, or do you think that these deeply fragmented value chains that we have built over the 90s and 2000s is going to still be the leading force in global manufacturing?
Well, if I think about large manufacturers like Caterpillar and some of the automotive companies, basically you build a supply chain for kind of each let's say, hemispheric currency zone. You want to be constantly working with that supply chain to be sure that they are globally competitive and they're helping you with your competitiveness. That's usually the purchased materials that go into an assembled product are greater percentage of total cost than your direct labor. So it's imperative that that be globally competitive, the supply chain. But I'd say, keep it in mind, the U.S. population is less than 5% of the total. Most of our global companies, headquartered in the United States, are basically have a physical presence in every major market area. Certainly, the Asian, you think about competing in Asia, you've got to compete with Japanese, Chinese, and ASEAN-related countries, and you've got to be the low-cost producer in that region for products that are very price-sensitive. Same in the Americas, same in Europe, and then you've got, to deal with fluctuating exchange rates, which can be undervalued for a period of many years sometimes. So all of these things go into the thought process of leading executives as they think about where to source from. And so I think the focus for the U.S. should be really on global competitiveness for the full value chain. Again, for manufacturers, a goodly portion of that cost is going to come from the supply chain. You've got to work with your suppliers hand in glove with them in a partnering way to help them be globally competitive for every component that goes into your product.
Steve. Yeah, Bart, there's a couple of comments online that I'd like to just point out.
Okay,
One
good.
comment is that we need to get kids to think, to get into the trades and tech services, but we need to change the perception of those things, engage career counselors and so forth. I think this is a huge point because, right now everybody says, you've got to go and you've got to get a 4-year degree in the liberal arts program, but oftentimes the job prospects for those folks that are educated in that system are less productive than, and certainly less valuable than some of these trades, and it's a reorientation. Another comment here is that some kids, millennials, saw that their moms and dads lost jobs through the Great Recession and are cautious about entering the same industries. Absolutely correct. You see these ongoing effects from displacements that stay in the psyche for some period of time. These are great comments.
Yeah, and actually that leads us to the last topic, to talk a little bit more about what can the policy environment do in order to help this going. And for that, we actually have another poll question come up, and then we're going to ask our panel to respond to that. So the poll question that's coming up here is, the most effective policy areas to support manufacturing is, obviously there are multiple, but if you have to choose from this list, which one would you take as the most effective policy area to support manufacturing? The first one would be guarantee open markets and free trade. The second would be foster high-tech manufacturing by protecting intellectual property and support R&D. More corporate tax reforms or corporate tax cuts. Create a pipeline of qualified workers for education and apprenticeships, community programs we talked about. Less but more effective regulation. New ways of finding support for small, medium enterprise, or infrastructure, both physical as well as digital, or something else that I've missed, in which case we'd like to hear from you what we missed. So there's a lot of possible answers, so we give you a few more seconds to talk about this, and then, Steve, let's continue the conversation you already started just a minute ago when we get the responses in on how this comes through. But let's give it 10 more seconds for people to think about it a little bit more, because these are complicated and all these things are important. So the question is, what is the one you find most important? And that is always making it a little tough indeed. So we give it 10 more seconds. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, short seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And now we will close the survey. So exactly half of you picked creating a pipeline of qualified workers, qualified workers, education, apprenticeship, community programs. That was half of you who picked it. A quarter of you said open markets and free trade, which I'd like you to respond to, Steve, because that's a big debate, of course, politically and policy-wise. 15% of you said foster high-tech manufacturing, better protect intellectual property, support R&D, and then some of the other responses are spread around. What's your first response to these results?
Yeah, well, absolutely. Open markets and free trade are critically important, but fair trade and following WTO rules and dealing with IP protections, and that's kind of what we're going through right now. I don't think we've changed our mind about open markets and free trade, but this point on this pipeline of qualified work skills, I think is a critically important one. Jim hit on it. look, in the business world, in the companies I led, our biggest issue was finding people who could fit into the jobs, and we were in a relatively simple industry in retail, and this is what we're missing. And so, CED, which is the policy arm of the Conference Board, has done a ton of work on this in terms of trying to make sure that businesses engage here. There's always been this Chinese wall between the business community and the education community. You don't talk, you don't interact, but you've got a big supply chain inefficiency between even our human capital, as I was saying before. So you've got people coming out of these institutions that don't have the skills, and this is creating a huge cost to American businesses to retrain and reskill people who have multi-year degrees, sometimes even teach them how to read and write in some cases. So there's a big gap here.
Right. So there's actually quite a bit of activity now in the chat box here. Again, people saying, how much attention do we really pay to trade and technical schools in order to get manufacturing talent? Somebody says, my wife is a teacher. She has been touting trade school policy as the biggest deficit. Would you agree with those statements?
I would agree.
And what should government do?
We agree entirely, and we've written a lot of papers on this, that we've glorified the college, the 4-year career, and that's not wrong. We're not trying to put Harvard out of business, but we have to make these the trade schools, the skill set development in these technical programs. We have to make community colleges, which is where the vast majority of students are in this country. We've got to make them and celebrate these places and understand that the great earnings power of the jobs that come out of this pipeline.
So, Katie, which policy areas are you focused on at McKinsey? And I'd also like you to respond on this tricky issue of open markets and free trade. Particularly going back to our earlier discussion, if you have these globally integrated value chains, how is a trade policy going to be effective in that environment? And, just focusing on tariffs on end products is not necessarily the best way to do that. So what kind of alternatives would you have there?
Yeah, I'm not a tariff expert, but certainly all of our research would suggest that the U.S. manufacturing base benefits from participating fully in the global marketplace. And so open markets and free trade, with all the caveats, Steve, that you gave, we think benefits the U.S. Manufacturing base. And the U.S. can be competitive in that global marketplace and should be. And so certainly I agree with the focus that this survey shows on the workforce. The place that I have more passion about than maybe this group does in the polling is the second one around fostering high-tech manufacturing. If you look at where we've lost jobs, sorry, I've got a bit of a cold.
That's okay.
If you look at where we have lost jobs, it certainly is in the labor cost arbitrage industries, apparel, footwear, etc. But it's also in high-tech industries where we should be gaining jobs. Germany has gained jobs over the last 10 years. In the high-tech area, we've lost, and there's no reason for that.
Well, we give you a little bit of a break here. Let's go to Jim, and then we'll come back to you in a second. So
she feels so strongly about this, it chokes her up every time.
Exactly.
Yes,
exactly.
That's true.
So Jim, let's go to you, and then we'll come back to you, Katie, just in a second. So when you look at these questions from a policy perspective, where do you see the focus? Where is the biggest deficit in terms of government activity?
Well, needless to say, I'm extremely concerned about this America First agenda recently embraced. I'm totally convinced U.S. firms can compete globally. Most of our leading multinational companies are leaders around the world, and we need to leverage, champion open markets, capitalism, rule of law, all the things that we've talked about for the last period since World War II. We've kind of championed and led in the global economy. We need to continue that emphasis. We need a stronger IMF that polices exchange rate policy. We need a good WTO, and we need to force countries that sign agreements with the WTO to comply. But again, it's leadership, and it's complex, and it requires diplomacy, but it's a real failure if the U.S. government doesn't get back out in front of this in a constructive way, as opposed to the I think Neanderthal way we've gone at with the blunt instrument of tariffs. And we did make some big improvements in our tax system. It's more compatible now with the world competitiveness, particularly going to territorial system for taxing our global companies. Very positive step in that direction. So I think trade is very important. I think training of people is very important, as we've been discussing. And, the last thing I want to mention is we have underinvested in infrastructure in a fairly significant way. And again, I think the role for government here, but, most of my corporate career I spent developing markets around the world for Caterpillar, and we had a far superior infrastructure to the Asian countries, for example. Yeah. When I started traveling there in the early 70s and through the 80s and 90s, but you could see them developing dramatically in that space.
Yeah.
To the point now that they have probably better roads, in the case of China, roads, ports, airports, air traffic control systems, and soon to be their internet and their grid. We've got to reinvest in this area to maintain global competitiveness. And that ought to be a real point.
Yeah, and thank you for putting in that plug, because I was so surprised that not more people on the poll picked the importance of infrastructure. Steve, I want to go back to regulation.
I realize falling behind.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, so we really need to invest in it. Steve, I want to go back to regulation, because it's clear that there has been over-regulation in many industries and that we need to have less. But we also need to have smarter regulation if you want to drive innovation and sustainability or better labor standards. These things quite often don't come that simply by free markets. So what are the best ways of where you think manufacturing will benefit most from a smarter way of regulating?
Yeah, and we've just issued a book on regulation. Yeah. And the business community has, and American society has embraced regulation in order to level playing fields, protect the occupants, put safety barriers around it. But then we have to let the markets work, right? And we have to clear the decks and let competition happen, because that drives innovation and it drives efficiency in the marketplace. So I think we have to think about it that way. There's some just practical things on how we do it. We need to have sunset provisions. We need to have look-backs. We've got to stop taking 1900 regulations and applying it to a digital society. So we have to be smart about those kinds of things. But it's the principle of making markets, flattening the playing field, but then getting out of the way. And we can't protect every occupant. Having the opportunity for people to fail in the marketplace is part of a dynamic economy as well.
Right. Look, we've got 2 minutes left. 1 minute, I think, almost. I want to ask you one final question, because each of you, we talked about business, we talked about government, we talked about education. We didn't talk about the public. And one of the things is, and actually Pew did an interesting piece of research that figured out that 81% of Americans actually know correctly that the number of manufacturing jobs has decreased in the United States. 1 of 3 actually do not know that actually manufacturing output has increased. They think the whole sector is in decline. So there's a public issue also. How do we communicate to the public that manufacturing has a future and that it is important for the US economy? So if you have one thing to say about how can we convince the public of the importance of manufacturing, what would you say, Steve?
Yeah, I just think we have to not fear the future. There's going to always be a base of manufacturing for reasons of national security and defense and those kinds of things. But then, do we want a smokestack economy? Do we want dirty water? Do we want rivers, in flames?
Which people associate with manufacturing quite often.
Well, and that's the way it was in the 60s and 70s. And I think we've evolved to a knowledge-based economy that has made us a wealthier society. It's made us the quality of living go up. All of these things, and I think we can't fear the evolution of it, but we have to also have policies that protect the people who are displaced by this evolution.
Right. Katie, what do we need to tell the public? Sorry, you're muted.
Go ahead. Manufacturing is high-tech, exciting place to work. It's an exciting place to develop a career, and it's essential for the vitality of the American economy, both in traditional ways, driving productivity and standard of living, but also it will enable all sorts of new benefits to our society in terms of more customized products, faster time to market, more response time, better quality of living for us as consumers. So an absolutely essential sector to continue to invest in.
Jim, you've been in manufacturing for so long. What do you tell the public about why this is so important?
Well, I think it's critically important for any economy to be vital. You've got to have a strong manufacturing sector. You've got to continue to invest in it. You've got to focus on the best technologies that your customers need and want for improved products. and you've got to be cost competitive, and I think competition is good for us. I also throw in one dimension. I think we need to think a little more strategically as a country. We don't need to worry about, we don't have aluminum smelters in the country because they're in Canada. I don't think that's a defense risk. It happens to be where very cheap, clean energy is available. But we don't want to find ourselves in a position where we don't do any high-strength steel or have any steel capability manufacturing in this country, because these kind of steel, aluminum, basic chemicals are a feeder stock for a lot of other downstream industries.
Right.
We need to think strategically about our defense interest and supporting downstream industry with at least some strategic thought about those industries and keeping a presence in them.
Well, thank you so much. There's a lot covered here. Jim Owens, Emeritus CEO of Caterpillar, Katie George, Senior Partner at McKinsey, Steve Utland, CEO at the Conference Board. Thank you for joining us. This is something that we will probably continue to talk about. It's a very important topic. It was a great conversation, also a lot of activity. Thank you all for participating, and a lot of activity in the chat box and a good communication amongst yourselves, which we much appreciate. Next month we will be back. That will be on October 23rd. We will be talking about China. We actually just coming out with our new economic outlook for China, and the question is, what's happening here? Is China really in decline, or is it actually beginning to recover? We've got a great panel already being set up. Some people already agreed, so we're looking out for that. And then in the final slide, we also have some other resources that you can access to the Conference Board. Don't forget about the evaluation. Thank you so much for joining us, and we will hope to see you again on any other webcast activity of the Conference Board. A good afternoon from New York. My name is Bart van Aert, Chief Economist.